Teaching and writing, Andrew organizes and educates with the Nashville People's Budget Coalition and others to create a world of safety and abundance beyond police and prisons. Wow, that's a packed paragraph of what you do. But as I seek to try to create a context, I'm just interested, how many folk here are church folk? Okay, well that helps me. That helps me quite a bit. As we were talking earlier about who would show up and why they would show up. And that helps me a lot. As I was sharing with him earlier, I just found out about 2 o'clock this morning as I was trying to prepare to at least fake it to make it through this and really engage in the text. I'm an abolitionist. And for people who know me, particularly here, it's the first time I've ever said that. And it's primarily because of my but it was only through my encounter with this work that I can acknowledge that. Because prior to that, what I encountered was not abolition, because it had its own vitriol and violence with it, which was untenable for me. But when you read here what abolition means, I think it really speaks to the Christian imagination. For me, in my work that I do, and for some, I'm considered a troublemaker, but I'm centered in this idea of the kingdom of God. His will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And the ethics that go along with that are foundational to me. And I was informed by the civil rights movement and the beloved community and what that means, which is not antithetical to the kingdom of God, where all of God's people have what they need when they need it. But in the space I am now, it's the common good. I don't need to show up in the space of the common good using kingdom of God language that is often problematic, but it's my foundation. It's what I believe, it's what I move in. So I say that to say, as we look at this work, which is really hefty, I've shared that with him. If he was trying to show his eruditeness, you get an A on that. And then I got to the conclusion where he waxes poetic about what life and the world could be if we would acknowledge some things that benefit some of us and some things that disadvantage some of us. If we could, in our common humanness, see these things together, which he wrestles hard to show us, the world could actually be a better place. So as I start, if that's a centering, tell me how well I'm doing.
Doing great.
In your introduction, you talk about your childhood experience. And what I missed in this was, what was the event or the occurrences that made you start looking the other way? Yeah, I read all about, your fear of hell and you got baptized. We share that too. But in your middle-class upbringing, what is that thing that made you look and begin to look the other way?
Not towards fear, but towards something else. I mean, I think for me, it probably had to do with that same context in which I grew afraid of hell was also a context in which I was part of a loving community of people, church folk, who, my family is right up here, was very much raised in that environment, and for the things that were things I had to unlearn with time, at the same time, I feel like I was given a structure, a model for people showing up for one another and caring about one another and bringing food to one another and asking about one another's well-being. So I have to believe that that planted a seed in me to see that fear didn't need to be the dominating force, but that love could be one as well. So in addition to my family and my parents themselves, but also our church family, I do think that our church had a tagline growing up in southern New Jersey about being like a loving church or something like that, they would say. And it really was. And so I am grateful for that aspect of what I've inherited from my tradition of Christianity, is people who assemble and who look out for one another and provide for one another, which you really see modeled in the early formation of that body. And in the book of Acts, people coming together and meeting each other's needs, and no one having any need because they met each other's needs. So that probably is a seed that would take root with time and allow me to see this vision of abolition that you're talking about as an expression of this world where people are helping to meet one another's needs, keeping each other safe, arranging communities in a way where people are flourishing as opposed to not.
Well, let me push you again, because we can come up in loving relationships that are also isolated from the greater communities and grow up and never encounter others on any serious level.
Right.
But from seeing you in these streets, you show up for folk. Where was that? What was your racial I'm trying to sound smart because he is a doctor.
Don't do it.
But I knew him before he was a doctor, okay? And I have to keep telling myself that, right? What was that? What made you racially conscious? And well, I guess racially and possibly systemically curious.
Well, one more word about the upbringing is that I felt like I heard as a young person that racism was behind us. And I even was in a church that was semi-multiracial, which is unique for churches of Christ, which is the tradition I come from. And would later come to realize that people being together doesn't mean that justice is taking place necessarily. People across racial difference coming together. And I think that a couple steps for me, one being my consciousness being raised around the time of the war in Iraq, when I was kind of having this existential crisis where my people at church were all like, the war is great, and my atheist friends at school were like, the war is immoral. And I was really thrown by that because I didn't really know, that there was another way of thinking as a person of faith. And I think entering into a aspiration of solidarity with people who lived in another part of the world was one beginning part of that. Another would come through just being culturally part of like punk music and things like that, where people were, caring on some level about social and systemic issues. But then I had some friends along the way who, my friend Alan, who some of you will know, who at one point when I was working for a nonprofit here, and he came to work at it as well, would say, we're talking about how it was a lot of women on staff as opposed to men, and then he said, it's also very white. I said, oh, I don't think I even realized that. So, whiteness is something that you don't have to, it's taken for granted, it's the norm, I don't have to think about it or see my own whiteness in relation to others. And so that, plus then shortly thereafter, when Trayvon Martin was murdered, a local organizer essentially put a microphone into my hand at a rally, saying that you have to say something. And I didn't know exactly what to say, but I said something, and from there got involved with kind of showing up for racial justice in various forms of trying to bring white folks into racial justice movement, and it's been a lot of learning along the way. And it's clearly something that when you're habituated into whiteness, which is a kind of a form of blindness in a lot of way to who you are and what the world is, there's a lot of unlearning and learning again, which I'm still on that journey for sure.
And I share with you that this book also sounds like a critique of the modern day church on some level. So to that I would ask, what is the approach that you feel is needed for the well-intentioned allies who for the most part hold all the power to understand how we are part of the problem?
That's a big question.
But don't forget your family's here, so you gotta come on here.
I think the answer has depended for me on it depends is what I want to say, in part, but that's a cop-out. I don't want to just end there. On some level, people who are showing a willingness to have their mind grown to some extent, who exhibit a willingness to be made uncomfortable, and that doesn't wreck their world. Those are folks that you can accompany and invite and encourage, but there are others who are not quite there, who I think need to be awoken in some other ways that may feel antagonistic at first, and that may agitate, which can be productive and generative actually if you stay with them. And then there are others who are so invested in these systems of white supremacy and exploitation and power over others that antagonism might need to be the first moment, and not necessarily in a hyper-combative way, but in an organized way, by which I mean people coming together to make clear what is wrong and to offer invitation to another way. The reality, as I have come to find, is that a lot of people may never be willing to come along to see that they can also benefit from another way. But the least we can do is to make clear that what is not what has to be, and is not what always has been, and therefore is not what always will be. And then for some folks, they need a hand held and to be accompanied, but for others, maybe someone else will come along in a few years after we've agitated them a little bit. We can't, no one person does all of those things at all times, or even at any point in their life, but it's a question worth asking for all of us in our various positions, I think.
Well, as a black man who can agree with you of these systemic issues that do exist, I'm also a participator as you would call in racial capitalism. I'm a benefactor, not to the level possibly of others that create generational, but I enjoy some of those things too, to where I actually seek some of those things. So what do you tell somebody like me? I'm not going to claim I'm your everyday common black guy, but what do you say to me who finds in my lived experience, it was toward the participation in it.
Yeah.
The generation prior to me, my parents, it was assimilation. She didn't use the word, but that was what it was. It was so you could participate.
Right.
And so we have a country now of folk who work hard, go to school, do those things to participate, thereby perpetuating it. What is the thing that needs to happen, from your estimation, that would jar us all to maybe rethink what it means?
Well, in terms of what we need to learn, one is that while you may benefit in some ways and aspire to benefit from capitalism, that you are also victimized by it. And that everyone in the room actually is victimized by it, no matter what our income level is, because I know that, I'm pretty confident there are no, billionaires in here. I think so...
Rahim back there.
Yeah. So if you're in the vast majority of people, then your life is made more difficult by capitalism, actually, even if in some ways you may get a little share of benefit from it. And so I'm interested in helping people see that a system that is designed to benefit a few at the expense of many, just like anatomically, that's how it's designed. And as I talk about in there, some of the early architects of this political economy we live in now, capitalism, were very clear that if there's no poor folks, there's no wealth. We gotta have poor folks, otherwise we can't be wealthy. Very straightforwardly. And that's built into the structure of this thing. And so I think that, modeling some other folks in the room I know, participate in kind of participatory and solidarity economy experiments where there are different democratic ways of sharing resources and wealth, and of making decisions about how money gets allocated and things like that. To me, these kinds of changes seldom happen in one moment. It's a little bit of a misnomer that revolutions are like a thing that happen overnight. I think that we're in a revolutionary moment now, meaning like this is a moment of transition this is the course of our lifetimes probably. And so it's a matter of people learning and helping people to see that a lot of the ways in which we struggle can be pointed back to the basic fact that we live in a system and in a society in which our basic needs being met is not a priority. And if that's the case, then that affects all of us on one level or another, even if we have different levels of income and access and whatnot.
You're an academic and a practitioner. I'm just a practitioner. And I'll make that clear. Although I'm informed by the academy, I'm a practitioner. My experience has been that there's always an uneasiness to reconcile the theory with the praxis.
Yeah.
And you being both, what is that for this work as you still show up in the streets? What is that hard part to reconcile?
Well, yeah, first of all, as you said, I did write this book over the course of a decade or so. It was first a part of my doctoral work, and then I revised it to make it what it is now. But that was the years of about 2010 to 19, 2012 to 2022 or 3 or so that I was really working on it. And so those are some active years in the streets here and around our country and around the world. And so for me, what I was experiencing on the streets, so in terms of accompanying people who are experiencing homelessness, as well as protest movements for racial justice and abolition and reform of various kinds, would in turn shape the questions that I was asking in my classrooms about in my theological classroom. So I did my degree in religion. So we're reading about God and ideas about God, and so that was shaping questions about that. And likewise, my questions of my reading and study inside the traditional classroom was shaping how I was looking at and trying to understand what was happening on the outside of the classroom as well. And so that's the starting point for me. And to me, there's no other way to do scholarship because, as Marx said in some version, paraphrase, that the point is not just to understand the world, but to change it. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times to change the world, you have to understand it. And so for me, this is one big exercise in better understanding the world that we've inherited in order to be able to change it. And so it is a work of theory oriented towards and shaped by practice, I hope, and that can inform better practice, hopefully too, which we can talk about.
Okay. I don't know how much time I have.
I think maybe if you have one more.
Yeah, no, I got several questions.
Let's do one more, and then we'll invite our friends up.
You were saying how, in your end of your last answer there, how this all works together and how it informs. And to that end, being involved in community organizing, often frustrated with it, do you think social movements today could possibly be more successful if they understood the correlations that your book so rather eruditely lays out?
That is the case I'm making. And I don't have the poster in here. Actually, Lindsay, could you grab one in a minute? And she'll get one. I condensed it into a poster that people can buy later if they want. That kind of gets at some of this. But so the book is, of course, if you don't already know, is trying to explore the role of religion in shaping systems of criminalization, incarceration, capitalism, white supremacy. Thank you. And, the argument is that these systems are they derive from religious thinking and ideas, and they are themselves a kind of religious practice in that, the one little etymological place to narrow in could be safety. Talking about police and prisons, they're often called public safety institutions. And safety, etymologically, is from the same root as salvation. Salvation and safety go together.
Sozo.
Yes, exactly. And so...
I was in that class.
You were in that class, to pay attention. And so, I think that what's going on with our country's mass devotion to policing and prisons as the answer to so many of our social problems is something related to religion and to Euro-Christian religion and American Christian, particularly white Christian religion. And so what I say that to say, these systems are fulfilling something existentially for people. It's fulfilling a kind of mythological level, structuring our way that we view the world and understand how it holds together. And so if you pull out, say, police and prisons don't need to be there, and we want a future where they're not there, and we want a future where these other systems are not there, that can feel like a bottom is falling out, like a building is coming crashing down around people, because it's so integrated with their sense of reality on like a mythological, existential level, even religious level. And so what I argue is that if that's the case, then our visions of abolition and of a world beyond these institutions also needs to fulfill what our current order fulfills in the sense of meaning-making on an existential level, on a mythological, here's how the world hangs together level, and even on a religious and spiritual level as well. And so this is the poster that you can get a copy of. It pulls from a few parts of the book to make one quote, which says, "If cops in cages fulfill a religious function on which people's sense of reality depends, then abolition must offer an even more irresistible means of transcendence and transformation on the way to a world made new." So, if we want to win that world, we have to meet people at that level of our depth as human beings and our meaning-making and our morality and our worldview, etc. Because just surface-level change the material conditions alone is not going to be enough to bring the people along who need to be brought along for us to get there.
Thank you for even allowing me, because again, I am a abolitionist now, and do I get a card? Do I get a card? Somebody give me a card or something? Are there membership dues or something? Let me know how this works.
We'll let you know.
Okay.
Yeah. Should we bring our friends up?
Yes.
All right. Let's bring up Janet and Rahim and Denzel and Preston all at once. I'm going to pull another chair up here. Why don't we slide down some and then we'll...
So I think you put one there. So I'm going to begin to my right, or to my right here is Reverend Dr. Janet Wolfe, who has worked as a poverty rights organizer, United Methodist pastor, college and seminary professor, community mediator, and learner and teacher inside prisons. She continues to focus on public theology, transformative justice, and nonviolent direct action organizing to disrupt and dismantle the cradle-to-prison pipeline through leadership by and partnership with those who are now or have been caged. She is a member of the coordinating committee of the National Council of Elders and on the board of the James Lawson Institute for the research and study of nonviolent movements. She is the author of Practicing Resurrection, the Gospel of Mark, and Radical Discipleship. Dr. Wolfe.
That was way too long.
Yeah.
I was going to say thank you, but it was way too long. It's a good gift to be here tonight. I'm honored to be part of the panel and part of this discussion. I look out, and both on the panel and in the audience, I see a lot of folks who are friends, colleagues, comrades, co-conspirators, companions on this journey toward justice. And I just want to offer gratitude at the beginning for your work and witness and wisdom, for your relentless embodied hope. I'm grateful to be here. If I could see Andrew, oh, he's way over there. Your book is thick. It's challenging. I think it's important and powerful, reckoning with where we are, how we got here, but most importantly for me, what might come next. I really like your dedication in the beginning. So you write it's not only for Lindsay, But it's also for all who have endured criminalization and for all who are building a world beyond it. And I guess I want to start there, because it seems to me that so much of your work comes from proximity. It comes from being in the middle of. It comes from inhaling the harm, carrying the grief and the sorrow, and in the middle of that, digging deep for some kind of hope. Not on your own, but provoked by the people around you. John Sobrino, Latin American theologian, says despair is a luxury. And for many people, that's true. So how is it that we come to a point where we really do see concretely what might yet be, the pieces of this world that we want? I'm reminded Reverend James Lawson, the architect of the nonviolent movement of the 50s and 60s, said when the Lawson Center opened at Vanderbilt, we do not have to have the world in which we live. We must help unravel the movements that can turn all of us in the direction of beauty and hope and truth, using the powers of love and life that are in all of us. And it feels to me that's what you're doing in the book, from the beginning to the end. So can you help us understand, what does it look like? Where do you see it? Is it taking on flesh anywhere close by?
Would you like me to answer that now?
I would.
Okay.
Yeah.
You were the one
I'm
that
not sure
set
the
this
format
up.
of this, but I
But
kind of
that's-
thought I got to ask a
yeah.
question. And then
That's what I thought, too.
Okay, good. Okay, got it.
What's the, you want me to, I'll answer it now. Or what do you want to do?
Yeah, no.
Okay.
No.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I appreciate that. And that's an honor that you would observe the book in that way and witness me in the book in that way. And thank you for that. And thank you for the way you've modeled some of these things for me over the years too, Janet. So, you know, the world is such a terrible place in so many ways right now, and increasingly so, and yet there are so many signs of hope if you look for them. To speak to what you said earlier, you know, being in proximity is really where the hope comes from. If you're just at home on your phone, there's not much hope to be had there. But if you're in proximity to people who are being victimized and who are trying to change that state of harm that's happening to them, and people who are organizing themselves to work with others to change those conditions, that is where hope comes from. So in the context, for instance, of the prison, you know, when I've been there over the years, through a pathway that you helped forge, the amount of hope and love and camaraderie and solidarity in there is mind-boggling. In the darkest places, you know, and the same goes for, you know, all the years that Lindsay has been working with folks on the street, and that I have accompanied that work as well. The people who are with the least, almost by definition, have the most willingness to give and to share and to create. And then, you know, with 2 nights ago now, a group of people came together over the last few months to say we don't want mass surveillance from the police in Nashville. And sure enough, we beat it back, at least for now. It'll come back again, but we beat it for now. And that was very much against the odds. And our BNA and Southern Movement Committee folks who have been here tonight, the creation of a dedicated office for youth safety in our city, like all that, there's lots of victories that have been won recently, and lastly, I'll say that people right now who are building networks of preparation to defend each other in the coming 4 years. It's very inspiring. So there's a lot to be inspired by, but proximity is the key.
Well, and I think my 5 minutes is up, but I want to throw out a possibility for a later discussion because you can't answer it right now.
Please.
So it seems to me that this is an indictment, not a possible indictment, but an absolute indictment of the church. That we have become what Walter Wink says, and you referenced Walter in your book, kept chaplains of an unjust order. That folks who read the story of this one who was criminalized, caged, convicted on trumped-up charges, and executed in a state-sanctioned murder, continue to be the theological justifiers for all those systems.
Right.
So we'll hold on that one and come back later.
Yes, please.
Thank
Because I only got 5 minutes. Okay.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move to Rahim Buford. Is a Nashville-based community organizer and thought leader with over 26 years of lived experience in the criminal legal system. As the founder of Unheard Voices Outreach and Unchanged Destiny Enterprise, he champions reentry innovations and advocates for decarceration and transformative justice. Rahim's journey includes co-founding educational programs like SALT, Schools for Alternative Learning and Transformation, managing the Nashville Community Bail Fund, and becoming a Galaxy Gives Fellow in 2023. He is a published author and a sought-after speaker, using his platform to empower those impacted by incarceration to reclaim their lives and build a future of freedom and opportunity. Rahim Buford, man, I'm up here.
Thank you very much. So good to be here with everyone. I want to first say I want to recognize the higher power, and I don't think the name matters because if you believe in something greater than things that thought enough of life that it would give us a chance to be in it. I just think that's important to bring into the space. And Andrew, thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this panel with my friends, really my community. I think it's a little deeper than friendship because I've known these individuals for many years. I think most of them I met inside a cage in a prison. And sometimes, I get the chance to just really feel a deep sense of appreciation for grace and freedom when I see people who remember where I was. And I also want to lift up the fact that, Andrew, you welcome me into spaces to have conversation. And it reminds me of Lipscomb University, David Lipscomb at that time. And I see some of my friends in the audience, I'll give some shouts out because I think people need to know Dr. Dark, one of my great friends. And I see Dr. Dan Jaranko, who kept the Vanderbilt Divinity School alive for River Bend after the late Harmon Ray passed away. May he rest in peace. And so, it's a privilege to be here, and I'm hoping we'll get deeper into the book. And I just want to admit that it was an intellectual enterprise for me to just even engage. I'm not a big reader. I love knowledge, but sometimes I just wanted to go down easy, and I don't really want to labor a lot. And I thought about, as I was reading, like, okay, I hope the academics will be courageous enough to grab the book, because this book will definitely have to be digested and broken down into discussion pieces, because there's a lot to be gleaned. But I want to begin with the introduction where, I guess in your innocence, in this, you gave the description of these camouflage individuals with G.I. Joe, right? And I grew up liking G.I. Joe. But soon after that, I saw where you and I had contradictory positions in life, where the police were your friends and the police were not my friends. In fact, we, at a certain point, quite clearly saw them as the enemies. And I think a direct connection to the title itself, my first experiences with the police, the law, being arrested at a very young age. I was 8 years old, shoplifting, and it was property, the pursuit of, and as this book deals with capitalism, and it deals with some inequities in how communities, we really don't see life the same way. Even if you're black, as Tucker, Reverend Tucker, Davie Tucker, I'm gonna just say Tucker, he's a friend of mine, he talked about the privileges that he enjoys as a result of capitalism, and my aspirations to, somewhere, because I would use the tool of money to do good. It would be, my motivations are quite different. But I went to juvenile, and I was caged for auto theft and burglary. And that was a trespass. That was an act to demonstrate, as Andrew had written in a book, about how the power of law, it can grab and snatch you and put you in places that you don't really understand it. And even going through it, you don't know what it is until there's a level of awakening consciousness. And it's not necessarily education, but it's recognizing that it's something different about me than my counterpart. And I got quite a few notes that I took, and I guess we can talk about that later. But I would say that I never said I was an abolitionist, and I don't know that I am. Maybe when I grow up a little bit more into, I look back to the original abolitionists for guidance, and I think one of my sheroes, Harriet Tubman, would have been classified as an abolitionist. And the work that I do, I consider myself a freedom fighter. I believe in uncaging bodies while these bodies still exist, and seeing them walk out of those places and spaces where they met me. And my work is devoted and dedicated to, I guess technically you could say decarceration, but I look at it as freedom, because while physical acts of walking out of a cage doesn't free you, there is a historical connection to not only the policing factor that dominates and keeps this system afloat, but when you look back to the plantation life and freedom being an aspiration, and that was over 400 years ago, and now we have mass incarceration, and we know the same playbook is being ran, it's utilized today. We're still dealing with the same problem. It's just, it's more crafty. It's subtle, and sometimes it might be Trump in your face. Right in your face. And but yeah, this is going to be a deep discussion. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to what comes back to me. But I do have my notes, and thank you very much.
Thank you. While we're passing the mic to the next, I just want to say that you don't have to claim abolition, but you're doing abolition every day, Rahim. So that's the work you're doing.
Right, thank you for that, Rahim. And I jotted down a couple questions just listening to you myself. Our next panelist is born and raised in Nashville. Denzel Caldwell is the Economics and Governance Program Manager at Highlander Research and Education Center. His work is centered on creating, developing, and facilitating popular education workshops grounded in solidarity, economy, and electoral justice for communities in the U.S. South. In addition to his work at Highlander, he also serves locally as the Sergeant of Arms for the Middle Tennessee Black Gun Club. as well as an organizer with the Black Nashville Assembly, Mr. Denzel Caldwell, who you're a paradox. So come on, let us hear from you.
Well, first off, Andrew, thank you for inviting me to this conversation. I do think it's an honor. I want to start off, with the statement that when I finished this book, for me it was clear that this book was written for three people. I think the first person, I think this is for the curious Christian who doesn't see Christ in cops' courts or cages, or whose Christianity continues to crucify Christ. I see the second person being, or the group of people being, for the white folks who need language for the ethical implications of your past, present, and future. And the third group are for those who are engaged in liberatory work, who have been scarred by the church, either as a former member or as an external recipient of the violence. What I appreciate about this text makes me think of a quote, believe it or not, from Fidel Castro, who talked about, the geopolitical struggles that are happening across the world being a battle of ideas, right? And what I appreciate about your text is that you reframe sort of that statement or that sentiment as a battle of faiths, right? If we understand or we use your definition in the Book of Religion as a set of practices, beliefs, policies that are shaped by a worldview that help us to understand and make sense of the world and help us to understand it, then this is a battle of faiths, or in another way, a battle of religions, right? I think when we talk about the relationship between chattel slavery, European colonialism, the birth of policing as we understand it in the United States, oftentimes there are conversations now that say, hey, the U.S. police system is rooted in chattel slavery, but what I appreciate is how you trace that history building on the work of other radicals and revolutionaries, but do it in a way that doesn't discard the religious undertone or the Euro-Christian undertone, but places it right beside the policies and the physical decisions that are made to build this empire, right? And as you said in the beginning of the text, oftentimes those who tend to take a more materialist approach to assessing where we are now tend to sort of kind of treat the religious aspect as secondary, but you remind us that it's central. It's central, right? Unfortunately, in so many ways, this empire has been forged with a cross in hand, right? And so I really appreciate that. And in so many ways, because of that, and because of that history you trace between sort of this colonial Christianity, the invention of whiteness, the birth of capitalism, in so many ways, this is not only an absolute indictment of the church, but this is an absolute indictment of this empire and those who live within it, especially those of us who call ourselves white, right? You give no room, and I appreciate that. You give no room. You make the stakes unambiguously clear, spiritually, politically, materially, et cetera, right? But what I appreciate most is that you offer an invitation, right? So if we're going to use the language of the church, you reminded folks or stated to folks at the end that the doors of that church are open, right? That another world is possible, right? One of abundance, one of fullness, one that does not put profit over people, but puts people's needs at the epicenter of this new world, right? You challenge colonial ideas of heaven, right? And I really appreciate that. And so, without, taking up too much time, I think one of the things, thinking about this current moment with the recent election, with conversations around what some may call Christian nationalism, I think what I appreciate about your text is that you remind us that this thing that we're calling Christian nationalism is not a new thing, but more so a returning to a colonial root of sorts, right? And I don't think it's a coincidence that you bring up the Christopher Columbus, you bring up the sort of missionary work of early colonial figures who shape, the early aspects of this empire. So I definitely appreciate that. And then, lastly, I think this is, just to kind of summarize my thoughts, I think this is an invitation, but I think this is, again, one that's an indicting invitation, one that calls us into our complicity to this empire that we're in, and calls for what Dr. King calls a revolution of values, right? Because one of the things that's so unique about the change that's needed within this country is that there is going to have to be a relinquishing of power, of resource, to the rest of the world in a way that some may say we've never seen. And so I'm really appreciative that you make that plain and clear in your text. Looking forward to talking more about it.
Thank you.
I think I'm gonna, okay, the next person is, well, right before I read Preston, you said something. Since we're in here with predominantly church folks, colonial ideas of heaven, why can't we get the picture right? As an indication of what grows out of that. Can't even get the picture right. Anthropologists, social scientists, everyone says the picture ain't right. That's for free. Next person is Preston Shipp. Serves as Associate Policy Director at the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. In his role, Preston provides strategic guidance, support, and leadership to states that are working to eliminate life without parole and other extreme sentences for children. Preston previously served as an appellate prosecutor in the Tennessee Attorney General's office. While serving as a volunteer and teaching college classes in Tennessee prisons, he became good friends with many people who were incarcerated, one of whom he had actually prosecuted. These relationships caused Preston to wake up to the many injustices that are present in the American system of mass incarceration. Unable to reconcile this conflict, Preston left his career as a prosecutor in 2008. Since then, he has taught in universities and churches, lectured at conferences, and written about the urgent needs for criminal justice reform, a shift in how we regard imprisoned people, and a new vision of justice that seeks healing, transformation, and reconciliation. Preston.
Thank you, Pastor Davie. Thank you, Andrew, for writing this book and for inviting me to reflect upon it. The two main things that I think you identify here in the book are whiteness and private property. And as you begin the very last chapter, you put the phrase that these are inherently oppositional forces. Whiteness and private property are both inherently oppositional in nature. You think about whiteness, whiteness is defined over and against people who are not white. There is no whiteness unless it's defined against non-whiteness. Same with private property. Private property is by definition exclusionary. That's how you get it, is it's oppositional. And as I reflected on that theme that runs throughout your book, it called to my mind the role of Satan as the accuser. Because Satan the accuser is also inherently oppositional. And I would say that this satanic spirit of accusation, it animates our entire society. That satanic spirit of opposition and accusation is like the water that we're swimming in. And sometimes it's just crystal clear, like in, when Donald Trump talks about immigrants. It's entirely accusational, it's entirely oppositional. But even if we get away from those really extreme examples, it's like everywhere. If we analyze the human predicament, as Andrew does, and analogize it to a courtroom drama, Satan in that drama plays the role of the prosecutor. And as you heard, that's the role that I play. And so it is an indictment. It is an indictment of this spirit of accusation that animates our society. It's an indictment of the criminal legal system, which is like the point of the spear. And it's an indictment of the church, the white church, as we heard. It's an indictment of me personally, as somebody who labored in this system, possessed by that satanic spirit of accusation, getting paid to incarnate that satanic spirit of accusation and condemnation in a spirit of institutionalized vengeance. So I say that as a confession. In a lot of ways, I don't feel like I belong on this stage with these folks based on the role that I have played at times. But I'm deeply grateful for the grace that I've been shown. This book is an attempt by Andrew to exercise that spirit. And I'm deeply grateful for it. It spoke to me, but it also made me think of a couple of people that Andrew and I know in common. You knew Andy Nash, right? Okay, yeah, I didn't think I was making that up. So Andrew Krinks and I had a mutual friend. He passed away a number of years ago. His name was Andy Nash. Andy Nash was a white guy and a Christian and a good guy. And he was a police officer. And I think that Andy Nash felt some of the angst of being in that adversarial, accusational, oppositional system. And it didn't always come out real clearly because in a lot of ways I think he believed in what he was doing. But sometimes, a little bit would break out. I remember one time he told me, he said, the tools that I'm given are not tools for healing a society. He said, I'm supposed to be about public safety, but the tools I'm given is a gun and pepper spray and handcuffs. And I could tell when he said that there was a little bit of angst behind it. And then I read in Andrew Krinks' book here, he's talking about slave patrols from hundreds of years ago and the tools that they had, quote, armed with guns, whips, and binding ropes. And I thought, golly, we haven't come very far in the tools that we give these folks, but we're asking them to do the same job. And it's not public safety, as Andrew points out. And I think that Andy Nash started to kind of catch glimpses of that and didn't like it. But then I think about another friend that we have in common, whose name I will not mention, also a white guy, also a Christian, also a police officer. And Krinks and I were in a small group Bible study with this guy. And a few years after that, Andrew was participating in a protest, and this fellow was undercover surveilling that same protest. So here's somebody that's part of our community, our white church community, again, animated by a spirit of accusation, surveilling the work of his brother in Christ. And I don't think there was as much angst in him, if we're being honest. I think about myself, I think about my experiences, I think about Andy Nash, and I think about that other guy. And I think, we all need to be delivered from this satanic spirit. And some of us are more aware of it than others. A lot of us are wholly, in the white church, a lot of us are wholly ignorant of it. But I think Andrew has done us a great service by writing this book. Wherever we are on that trajectory, it's kind of a sliding scale. Wherever we are, we have a lot to learn from reading it about, what that spirit does, how it works, its history, and what it's going to take for us to be delivered from it. So thank you.
Thank you, Preston. And right before we turn to Preston, I just want to say the black church is not innocent. And when you keep hearing him say the white church, the black church, by most academics would say 25% at the max were ever involved in civil rights, slavery abolition, or any of that. And many say that that number is high. That prevails today. Here in Nashville is the largest Black Baptist organization, the National Baptist, that now there's a couple others, but the Progressive Baptist Convention started when the National Baptists would not allow Martin Luther King to speak from the floor at a convention. So I want to say to what you're acknowledging, I have to acknowledge I'm a pastor of over 20 years. And it is one of the most, much like white church. You say it enough, long enough, that's half of it being true. And so much in my own church, when I took the flag out and had a painter come in and darken up the Jesus, they held a meeting on me. So to your point, that's not true to think that the white church is the problem. Our American understanding of a Eurocentric Christianity is the problem. So I just thought I needed to say that. Now we're going to hear from...
Actually, I don't need that. Sorry, I forgot. I have this on.
Andrew's going to respond to the panelists.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just briefly, very briefly, just for time so that we can open it up to anybody else who might want to join the conversation. But thank you all so much for taking the time to do this. I look up to each of you and appreciate my friendship and camaraderie with each of you. And I always have a little bit of, I feel a little bit bad when I ask someone to read it because it is pretty thick and it takes work. It is a labor to read it. So I'm grateful that you've taken the time and to share your thoughts with me. I don't have anything super coherent other than to say, one of the greatest gifts for me, having written this thing, is to then hear it spoken back in other terms to me in a way that's clarifying about what I thought I was trying to say or what other people are seeing in it. So thank you for offering that. Rahim, I appreciate the story, the way that you narrated how we shared something in common when we were both kids, but then we went our separate ways. I am so grateful to have met in the times and places we have and to be able to reflect on that distinction between the paths that we've been on in life, which are quite distinct. But I'm grateful to be in struggle and in movement and in the work of justice with you, and I appreciate what you shared. And Janet, your question about the indictment on the church, it's at the front of my mind. And as I think about, what we're heading into in terms of the proliferation of a lot of the things that this book is about, and the expansion of a lot of the powers that I'm critiquing in the book, I've been thinking about, how do we get to churches in a way to, I really want to help. I would love to help church folks see that the vision of abolition that I understand, as I understand it, is such a beautiful expression of so much of the Christian tradition, understood in a certain way. And so to help people see that, though, is such a challenge when we're so deeply entrenched in what we are entrenched in. And Preston, I really appreciate the way that you, your kind of confessional demeanor there. I mean, to say that I played the role of Satan in a way is quite a statement, and I will remember that for a long time. And appreciate the work that you've done, the book that you've written, and I think that I wish that all people in law school preparing to be a prosecutor would have to read what you have written, because we'd have a lot fewer prosecutors as a result, which would be nice. But thank you for the framing of exorcism. That's such a compliment to me. Exorcism is a kind of a word that, for a lot of people, feels kind of like, whoa, like that's some weird, casting demons out type of stuff is pretty, but theologically speaking, like we're talking about, and you mentioned Wink earlier, Janet, Walter Wink, the idea of like the spirit of evil inhabiting systems and structures that deal death in the world, and thinking about the need to cast out the demons from our midst in so many of our churches and in so many of our institutions that run and order our society. So thank you for that framing. And Denzel, the idea of a battle of ideas, a battle of faiths is very clarifying, and the colonial idea of heaven, really getting at that oppositionality that, heaven is only heaven if there's a few of us there, which, interestingly enough, I grew up in a tradition where in a church, certain aspects of a Church of Christ tradition are such that you understand heaven as the place where only the people next to you in the pews are going to be. Like Mother Teresa was definitely not going to be there. People like that. So, they're right there. That helps me. It's clarifying to me that phrasing of a kind of a paradise where a few belong, but many do not. And so, thank you for speaking back really in clarifying ways what you got from the book. So, I don't want to take too much more time. I'm done saying what I want to say now. I don't know if, Davie, you want to do any other kind of like bringing together or asking anyone else any like 5 minutes worth of follow-up before we open it up to others and keep going from there.
Well, you tell me, to open it up to 5 minutes, I'm going to have to pick one. Denzel. Can you extrapolate a little bit more around what you said? I'm trying to find it on my notes. You were the one that said a battle of faiths. I like that, a battle of faiths. What do you mean, and what are the competing faiths that are at work?
I appreciate that question. So in the text, I'm using the definition that Andrew used for religion being a set of beliefs, ideas, practices that are all shaped by a particular worldview, in an attempt to make sense of life, honestly. And if we use that sort of definition, then we can recognize that societies are the byproducts of beliefs, practices, and worldviews that try to make sense of the world made material, right? They turn into public policy, they turn into architecture, they turn into relationships between people. And so if we're thinking about the history of the United States, and we're thinking about the European colonial ideas and practices that included the genocide of indigenous people here on this continent, the enslavement of African peoples to build this empire, and the using that as the architectural basis to shape not only how capitalism is practiced here, but also how it dominates the rest of the world, right? We have a particular faith that is invested in the maintenance of this empire, right? When we think of the nationalism that's associated with the red, white, and blue flag, and the violence and the cognitive dissonance that comes with that, using your definition, that is a faith. And that is something that is continually upheld in so many ways. In opposition to that, you have those of us who come from the people and lineages of those who, in many different ways and in many different forms, were victimized by this process, by this faith, right? Who had a set of practices, beliefs, and worldviews that shaped society, some of which preceded this empire, some of which live in parallel to it, right? Who believe in a world that is not defined by scarcity, right? Because they understand in their attempt to make sense of life that this thing that we call scarcity, or sort of a zero-sum game, is manufactured. As you had referenced in your text, poverty is a byproduct of wealth accumulation. Like, without poverty, you cannot have wealth, right? And so there's also a faith that recognizes that we can live in a world where those constructs don't exist. And so that is embodied in so many ways by the practice and the faith of abolition.
If I could add to that quickly, that the book ended with an introduction and conclusion that are titled, the introduction is the religion of mass criminalization, the conclusion is the religion of abolition. And so there really are, it is an idea that there are these competing ways of making meaning of reality in the way that the world should look in light of that reality. And that they are quite different from one another, even if they at times exist within the bounds of the same religious tradition, even at times. Mm-hmm. The tradition that gives us the slave owner and the enslaved person both, or who, those who practice Christianity within that context.
So in this battle of faiths, as you said, and I appreciate that, Denzel, I'm going to use that. By me not being an academic and being a preacher, we never have to cite anything. and no one can do anything to us. So God said that. When you say the battle of faiths and you juxtapose those two, does it bleed over one? And do we maybe believe in the other more than the church? If it's this battle, that means at least there's this vacillation or something. How would you say we come down if we only had one? What would be the one, do you think, would possibly be more valuable to us from your perspective?
Between the religion of mass criminalization and the religion of abolition?
Oh, but no. I'm trying to do a ride off of what you originally said in the book, what Denzel extrapolated on, and how I'm looking at these competing systems that are operating. Yeah. You got capitalism at work, you got religion at work, and each one of them has their own faith. Because we do certain things that show that we believe in these systems. Right. Between capitalism and the Christian faith, I'm probably not a good question answer to get you talk not as thick, but as deep. Which one would be stronger in your estimation? Because they support each other. They're intertwined. I think it's at a point now that they can't be separated.
Yeah.
So what's your assessment of that?
It is troubling how deeply intertwined all these things are. I say throughout the book, you couldn't have had slavery without Euro-Christianity. You couldn't have had racial capitalism without Euro-Christianity. You couldn't have police or prisons without Euro-Christianity. And that's quite an indictment on the thing that I still claim as part of my, maybe not the Euro part as much, but Christianity. And so, yeah, that can seem pretty hopeless, that these things have been so interwoven for so many centuries now that the idea of pulling them apart seems nearly impossible. And yet, there have always been, all throughout the millennia, experiments, often in the wake of the wreckage of the downfall of the empire, of the attempts at empire, of people who go out to the desert or form a new community within the ashes of the old one, or take up the work of being church or people of faith or people of God in the midst of a world dominated by the other version of it. There have always been those witnesses to other ways within the dominant streams. And to me, that's where, if I have a theology of the Spirit, it's that's where the Spirit circulates, is in the places where the systems and structures are cracking and new experiments, and which are often very old experiments, are taking root again, which end up giving life and energy and capacity to people to try new things. So there's probably no extricating the two. I think maybe the parts that are so deeply interwoven need to die along with the parts of the systems like capitalism that need to die, in order for new things to be born. There's some metaphors in the sacred texts about that, right? About things dying in order for new things to be born. So I think we need to see some things die. And then I wish that so many people weren't going to die in the process, but they will. And I don't mean my enemies, I mean people who are going to be discarded, and have been already. But I think it's up to those of us who believe in freedom and life to push to make that world real, even if we don't see it in our lifetime. And I'm a believer in those who say that, what we're doing right now is going to have. I only have ever gone into a prison because, Janet didn't know she was going to make a path for me, and I will make a path for others. These effects ripple out, and so we do what we can from where we are. I got a little preacherly and poetic there, but I'll wrap it up.
Oh, I see that.
Yeah.
I see that. Well, we want to open this up, the remainder of our time, to the audience, and we'll take questions now. The pastor gonna come help us.
Yep.
Yeah, you must be Baptist, because we have to do everything.
Preach it.
Anyone have a question for the author of this
Or
challenge?
I may direct it to somebody else too, but it doesn't have to be. I'm always saying when I'm in a classroom as a teacher, you don't have to have gotten the perfectly well worded. It can be a word vomit, and we'll take it. So that is very much welcome too.
Well, I know you have questions, or you would not have come. There we go.
This will be a word vomit. I haven't read the book. I'm excited to read the book. I found this through the Highlander Center, and I'm really delighted to be here. I'm someone who's not religious, and maybe I'm like audience 2 and 3 of what Denzel shared. But it has a lot of like synergies with me with a book that I'm really enjoying by Prentice Hempel, What It Takes to Heal. That's maybe makes kind of a similar argument about how all of us have been kind of like walled off from feeling, and an argument.
Say that again.
Walled off from feeling.
Walled off from healing, yeah.
Feeling.
Oh, feeling.
Feeling.
Yes.
You know, that the systems that we're in are so violent, and we're all kind of like living through these generations of trauma that it's almost impossible to deal with, you know, until you take the time to really feel it deeply. And so I wonder about the connection for people like me who are not religious and kind of get that idea of like, oh, when I actually like feel into my sadness or my anger, what shows up? How do you speak to those kind of folks?
Thanks for that. Yeah, so I come from a Christian background, and this book speaks to the complicity of Christian ideas in the formation of these institutions. And in the conclusion, it speaks to the fact that not just that Christianity can find its abolitionism, again, I would say, because it's had it in the past, but that abolitionists can understand their abolitionism as a kind of faith, not necessarily in the form of like confessional precepts about in a monotheistic sense, but you know, at the basic level. And I'm not the first to say this by any stretch, but the idea of another world is possible, or you know, so many of the mantras of a lot of the movements that we're in. I believe that we will win. I hear people talk about that as a statement of faith, that, you know, this belief in the possibility of a world arranged otherwise that is, that most would say is completely naive and even otherworldly, so much so to be scoffed at and disregarded and dismissed. And yet, people lean into it so hard that they devote their lives to it. Like, that resembles a faith in a way. And I don't need you to call it a faith. Like, that's not important to me, really. But what is important to me, and I'm part of what I'm arguing in the book, and what I talked about in this quote that's on the poster, is that, like, these visions of other possibilities need to be able to tap into the depth dimensions of being a human, which maybe resonates with the Prentice Hempel aspect of feeling. That, you know, to the path towards that other world is not just one of the shift in policy or the rearrangement of an institution, but it is transformation of heart and mind and sociality, the relationship, the way we arrange ourselves, and the way we feel and the way we sense and perceive. So it's partly an argument that if our current systems fulfill that depth dimension for people in a way that's damaging and harmful, then we can essentially replace it with new ways of meaning making and, you know, ways of making sense of what is ultimately real. And so that's how I would speak to that. You know, that doesn't have to be a confessional faith tradition that's observed in a textbook. That abolition structurally, to me, looks like a faith, even if it's quite distinct from other ones. So, thanks for that. There's another one up here.
There we go. All right. Like Andrew, I also grew up in the Church of Christ tradition, which kind of holds this, the text is the most important. This plain reading of the text. We speak where the Bible speaks. We're silent where it's silent. And what's interesting is how much the Bible speaks about wealth and poverty, But those are the things that are hemmed and hawed and kind of rationalized. Well, what Jesus, when he talked about the wealthy, he didn't really mean. And so it's interesting when thinking about abolition, right? If y'all will allow me to read from the Bible, in Luke chapter 4, Jesus kind of has his first sermon. And he goes to the synagogue, and what he says is, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, the recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord." And like that right there, like abolition from day one, release to the captives. And so why is it that you think in, maybe more liberal, progressive churches, what the Bible says about gender, sexuality, there's room for growth there. There's room for reinterpretation. But it's really, really, really hard to find a church in America that takes what Jesus says about wealth, takes what Jesus says here about abolition, to really read it, take it at its face value. So why do you think that some issues, there's room for interpretation, but it seems like in the American church, anything that critiques the capitalist mode of production is kind of, no, we don't go there.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's great to see you, Jacob. Thanks for coming. I wonder if it has to do with what we talked about, which is the entanglement of this tradition with the emergence of those systems. Even if you don't have to know the history to know how much connection there is, even on like a subconscious level, between the tenets of morality under capitalism and a carceral society, because there's so much from that comes from our tradition, aspects of iterations of our tradition. I think that because we're so entrenched in punishment, and there's so much theological basis for punishment being a good thing, that it becomes hard to if that's already so established, then when you get to Luke 4, it's a lot easier to read that as people captive to sin are being released from their sin, than to think that people being held captive may be released from their physical captivity in some way. I did a paper for Segovia when I was a master's student at Vanderbilt Divinity School, and explored that text, asking who the captives were, and discovered that debt was so prevalent at that time, and that in a lot of cases people were held captive in some way because of their state of indebtedness to somebody else. And people hearing Jesus say that in that context would not have just heard, "Oh, he's talking about my sin getting released." Like, people hear captivity and they know there's something material about that. And so, but when you come down the line and hear now about captivity and release from captivity in a world in which captivity is so meaningful to our sense of order and morality, then it's hard to hear that as meaning something concrete. One of my favorite lines from Will Campbell, the Baptist minister and civil rights movement actor, was pretty much in his funny way something along the lines of, I've been, it was a letter to somebody who was talking about like reading the Bible literally. You may remember the quote better than me, where he said, "I heard that you think the Bible is the literal word of God, and I thought maybe you'd be ready to go down with me after church on Sunday. There's a prison in West Nashville. Thought you could help me break it down and tear it down." Of course the response is, "What are you talking about?" But we're literal in some ways, but not in others, for sure. Do you have? Yeah, please.
I won't be long. I'll just say it like this. I think anything that, creates a disruption, discomfort, that actually you have to get out of your home and move, it's going to be looked away and frowned upon. I mean, it's just like with the Matthew 25, visiting those who are in prison or feeding the poor, doing those kinds of things that you actually physically have to go and do something. That's not going to be taught, because then you have to make the gospel a reality, a real thing. It has to become flesh. And when fear, even before you get to the fear, you like, why is it so easy for this to happen? When the faith itself imposes a strict punishment on your behavior if you don't conform to certain ways. Like, there is this idea that hell, and there's this thing that, like, I'm always fighting or always working to earn my way into heaven. And there's certain things that I just can't do. And so this fear is always dominating the minds of the people who say they believe in the one who sacrificed his life so that everybody could live. And so I think the discussions that have to take place in communities like this, the book is a conversational piece for you to start thinking deeper about, like, you know, where do I fit in this book? Where am I in this book? You know, am I on this side where I believe that in my whiteness that God exists? Tucker talked about, he darkened up his picture of Yahshua, Jesus, and it's just a lot anyway, but I just thought that made sense, that if I really have to actually do something, then maybe that's not what I believe. This is my thoughts.
And just to his point, that's, I caught it in a black church when I attempted to make Jesus more color representative of who he was in a black church that's gotten used to white Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Denzel, you want to answer?
Oh, yeah. The only thing I would add to that is I would like everything that we do is within a certain context, right? And particularly in this case, a socio-political one, right? And so there's no instance, despite how some might frame it, where our faiths don't have political implications. So to your point, you know, what does it mean for us to be able to address certain aspects of, like certain inequities of society that in some ways might be manageable or controllable? And then I'm thinking particularly about your way of thinking about private property, these things that don't necessarily fully disrupt the order, or maybe might be secondary, or maybe symptomatic of the core issue. But I think if we do that instead of getting to the root, or you know, as we think about being radical, like in the literal sense, that means to go to the root of a thing. If we don't go to the root of that thing that produces these inequities as it relates to queerphobia, to misogyny, these things like that, then, you know, we're not able to fully understand the things that people feel comfortable enough to address. And then when you go to the root of that thing, you realize that people addressing those things are really just, you know, tolerating them, rather than, as others have said, looking for themselves in the great indictment of the problem that we're trying to wrestle with through text. Because in so many ways in the book, and many others who you cite, when we're able to engage with the prisons and the cages and the policing in this country, in so many ways, that is a raw, honest reflection of our outlook towards the other things that we're claiming to wrestle with, whether we're talking about gender or sexuality, whether we're talking about reproductive rights, whether we're talking about racism. Like, those are tested in the cage, and I would argue also at the border. And so, like, in so many ways, there's a performance that happens when we're addressing these things without also addressing the question of the cage.
Could I suggest that we let Preston and Janet have another word, and then we probably wrap it? And I want to say that, and maybe you get the final word, but I'd love to, if anybody has other questions, I'd love to follow up. And actually, let me take this time real quick to say that there is a resource table out there with some info from some of us and some of the organizations that we're part of. There's also a lot of food, and I mean a lot, and I want you to take as much as you can, and the books and posters will be for sale, and I'll sign them if you want, and talk to anybody who wants to. So, Preston, please.
Well, I will just read. This is on page 70 of Andrew's book, and I think it speaks directly to kind of what you were saying. Andrew writes, "The deities that religions revere often function as implicitly projected manifestations of the collective identity of those who are doing the worshiping. As a result, the reverence that communities direct towards a society's god or gods often functions doubly as a kind of reverence for the social order itself." And I think about that quote in connection with your point. I'm also Church of Christ. I know the pedestal that we put the Bible upon. But even so, if we read something in that book that contradicts or threatens this sacred social order, the sacred social order wins. So even when we've got something there in the red letters that says, that disrupts it, since we have projected that social order up onto a divine canvas, we can't afford to feel that tension. And so we say, that's not what Jesus meant, because if that's what he meant, that gets at my idolatry, and we're just not going to go there.
On page 238, Andrew writes that he's inviting us into life-sustaining ways of responding to and navigating harm with tools that transform the conditions that create harm. And he's looking very concretely at transformative justice. I wish we had more time to wrestle with that. There are some resources out on the table, and I've listed some specific cases that are going down at the moment. Jeff Noland is here, who was caged and is one of the authors of one of the books out there. There are a number of people in here who are already concretely doing some of that work. But I hope everybody is working on redefining prison ministry, because I think it may be the most damaging piece that we're doing as the church.
Amen.
If we could redefine prison ministry and move it from ministry to and for to ministry with, from a program to authentic, no-kidding, long-term mutual partnership, and from charity, which is violent, to justice, we could change the systems that we're talking about. And Dume Alatushani, who many of you know, spent 20 years on Tennessee's death row for a crime he didn't commit, more than 26 years in a cage. And he says, all those years, church folks coming in trying to save my soul. Hell, I didn't need anybody to save my soul. I needed somebody to save my ass. I hope that we move from this time together, not only to wrestle with Andrew's wisdom and challenge, but to work collectively on very concrete ways that we can embody the alternative here and now.
I'm going to make my short comments. Again, I am glad that you even asked me to be involved, and I've already been transformed in a way. But I have a saying that the authentic practice of ministry will soften the jagged edges of our doctrine, because it's our doctrine that injures people. That we're so set. And there's a passage of scripture about Moses and the burning bush. We've heard it 1,000 times. He's asking two questions. He wants to know, how is it on fire and why won't it burn up? He moves around it And that would be what I would suggest to us for the first two that Denzel outlined, the curious and the second one. As he moves around, he's still trying to answer his questions. We have to move around. You can remember the spot where you were, but if you never move around, you never see a different perspective. And again, just in my whole churchness, we love the Bible, but the Bible provides all of that. He was never in any violation of when he hears the Lord say, take off his shoes. He never knew where he was, but he was trying to figure it out. And I think sometimes in our Christian selfishness, we've stopped trying to figure this thing out. And I appreciate you creating a challenge for us here. Don't get overwhelmed by the large issues, because they can be daunting and you won't even come out of the house. Practice little justice. How you treat women and children. How you treat those who are less than you. How you just treat common humans. Practice little justice. It gets you ready for big justice. Again, I appreciate you letting me be involved in this.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you all. Thanks for being here.